Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. Sorry to keep a few of you waiting. I think that there was a slight mix-up in some of the times or invitations that came through on Outlook versus the original invitation, which was at 10 o'clock. So apologies for that. First of all, I'd just like to welcome you all and to what is going to be GFIA's last training session for 2020. This is going to be our training session called Investing in Cannabis Part 1. And this is certainly a new subject matter for GFIA to cover in these seminars, and no doubt for many of our members as well. It's certainly an industry which we've been following in GFIA with interest, as developments in the non-recreational segments of the cannabis industry, especially medical and the pharma side, have become ever more mainstream. And locally, you might also be aware that in Gibraltar, GFIA and other associations have been working with our local policymakers and are very hopeful that reforms, especially around the Proceeds of Crime Act in relation to cannabis, will start to open the sector up locally in a more meaningful way, which is good news. So with that in mind, the background, that's a bit of background to the seminar, why it's coming about. We hope the seminar is really going to provide everyone with a broad overview of where the industry is at today, and should help to demystify and explain some of the industry specific terminology and the variety of products and uses and benefits of cannabis in a modern society, and hopefully dispel a lot of our misconceptions along the way. So without further ado, it's my absolute pleasure to warmly welcome our speaker today, called George McBride. George is a commercial barrister based in London, and he co-founded and is the CEO at Hanway Associates. And they specialize in advising companies that are wanting to set up or currently involved in various parts of their legal cannabis industry. So George, very warm welcome, and maybe just to ask everyone, if you'd like to raise questions, please can use the chat function during the seminar, and we will of course make sure there's time at the end to cover questions. Okay, George, over to you if you don't mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you everyone who's joined us to hear a bit more about opportunities in the cannabis industry. So to start with, I wanted to just set out, the kind of scale of the industry that we're dealing with. So worldwide legal cannabis industry spending has reached $30 billion in 2020. And predicted by Euromonitor to reach 95 billion by 2025. There have been some quite wild market forecasting and sizing estimates going out about the cannabis industry, but this latest report from Euromonitor is quite a sound report, and I think $95 billion in legal cannabis sales by 2025 is very achievable for the industry. Recreational cannabis sales is what is likely to drive that global legal market growth over the next 5 years. So at the moment, we have Mexico due to implement legislation once it's agreed to legalize cannabis for non-medical purposes, as well as Luxembourg in Europe, and at least 5 states in the USA, which will be legalizing either medical or recreational cannabis next year. So I'm from Hanway Associates. I'm one of the co-founders. We, as Tim said, we help people operate in this sector, whether it's large established businesses looking at pivoting or the potential disruption of the sector, or supporting entrepreneurs. We have the strategic consultancy. We have a communications team. We have a professional network with 5,000 members around Europe who operate in this sector. And we have a joint venture with the property group Savills and the construction and engineering group Cambridge HOK and the securities group, Sabrosa. So we offer a whole range of services to this nascent European cannabis industry. And we do this through partnerships. We previously founded and operated Europe's leading cannabis conference, Cannabis Europa, which we sold last year, but is still running. And we have a range of other partnerships and projects which help us engage with the industry. But that's enough about me and my organization. I'm here today to talk to you about the cannabis industry. Recreational sales are predicted to capture 67% of that 95 billion I mentioned before. So there's medical cannabis, adult use cannabis, which is the new polite term for recreational cannabis, and CBD, which is all of your kind of products that are currently sold in Boots and Holland Barrett and elsewhere. So here you can see kind of how that growth is going to come. And this is particularly interesting because currently most of the Commonwealth can't invest in recreational cannabis businesses legally due to proceeds of crime and money laundering implications, despite those businesses being legal in the markets in which they operate. So it's important to understand all these different segments of the cannabis industry because it can get quite complicated. So there is pharmaceutical, which is basically just GW Pharmaceuticals, which has two fully licensed products, which they provide, one for multiple sclerosis and the other for a few different forms of pediatric epilepsy. So pharmaceutical cannabis is cannabis products which have gone through all of the traditional pharmaceutical approvals and clinical trials. And we're expecting more of those products from GW and in the future others. And those products can be sold around the world as any other medicines can be, on prescription and through traditional healthcare channels. Then we have this new area, medical, which is driven by reforms for compassionate use around the world. And medical markets can differ a lot from a medical market in, say, California to the medical market in the UK. But what you've got here, the joint shared issue is that this is for people who have a medical use, and these products haven't gone through full clinical trials. Then we have recreational, which is obviously people using cannabis products for their enjoyment. And then we have wellness, which is this another kind of new area, which is products which aren't psychoactive, they don't give you the high, but there are various different claims of their benefits, although these products can't make any medical claims because they're sold over the counter as food products or supplements. And this is a real fast growing part of the cannabis market around the world as well. And then we have the more traditional uses of the cannabis plant, which is for textiles, papers, bioplastics. The cannabis plant in its hemp form has fantastic bioremediation properties. It's the second fastest growing crop behind bamboo, and it has fantastic carbon sequestration and a very, very good properties for producing industrial materials. So this is a growing part of the kind of wider cannabis market as well, but with little regulatory issues. So here's a map kind of setting out some of the a kind of very top level view on the laws here. What you'll see is that most of the Americas have reformed their cannabis laws to a certain extent to allow cannabis markets. Some of Europe, some of Southern Africa, and then pockets, small pockets of slight reform in Asia, with the most notable being quite a sizable medical market growing in Thailand at the moment, and a large medical market in Australia as well. But what we're seeing is this pace of reform gathering over the last few years. So here is a bit of an introduction to the cannabis plant, and I will try and keep it relatively simple, but it's not a simple plant, and it has a huge range of different applications, a very wide range of different varieties, and a lot of different industry jargon associated with it. But essentially, you have the cannabis plant, and under that you have two different main distinctions in the market, and that's between hemp and cannabis. Hemp is a legal definition which makes an exception for low potency cannabis to be grown for its industrial uses. But as this market has evolved, you now get hemp being grown for its flowers for CBD as well, which is the non-psychoactive compound, which is a licensed pharmaceutical product in the form of Epidiolex for the treatment of epilepsy, but also sold over the counter for things like anxiety relief, sleep aid, etc. There are a number of benefits, reported benefits, anecdotal evidence around its use. Then you have the cannabis plant itself, which can produce both CBD and THC, as well as a range of other compounds, but those are the two main compounds that it's grown for. And those CBD and THC are both used in recreational products, they're both used in medical products, they're both used in pharmaceutical products. So I'll talk about the products a little bit more, but you'll see that there are some similarities for all the different uses that they're purchased. So that's a little bit about the plant. THC, the bit that gets you high, CBD, the bit with a lot of reported anecdotal medical benefits, as well as some proven ones. So the kind of most interesting bit of the plant for most of the market is the flower, which has glands which produce trichomes, and those trichomes produce cannabinoids, flavonoids, and terpenes, all of which have different effects on the body, smells, tastes, so that you end up with this really wide array of different reported effects from different cannabis varieties. But the main bit from a medical perspective is the cannabinoids, with the other parts potentially having some influence on the effect, but also having a big influence on smell, aroma, taste. So the reason this is all interesting for you today is that there are potentially these reforms coming through in Gibraltar, which are being backed by GFIA, and they mean that it's worth taking a look at this sector and the investment opportunities which it presents. So the Proceeds of Crime Act has created challenges to investing in recreational cannabis companies in the UK and other jurisdictions which are largely based on UK law. So this fairly poorly drafted piece of legislation, which was supposed to be to prevent companies spending the proceeds of crime in the UK, has quite a wide ambit, and meant that anything which a company does in another jurisdiction, which would be illegal if done in the UK, money associated with the proceeds from that business is then deemed to be the proceeds of crime. So because the UK doesn't permit the sale of cannabis for recreational use, a UK investor could not legally invest in a recreational business in Colorado. Now, the reality is that the enforcement has been non-existent for these provisions, yet nonetheless, for companies which take their obligations to comply with the law seriously, it has stopped a lot of money flowing into the industry, and made it difficult for people in the UK to get involved. Despite the fact that recreational cannabis businesses are listed on public exchanges, and there are UK investors who freely trade in these stocks with no enforcement occurring. So it's created this very unfair grey area in which there's an illegality but a lack of enforcement. So this sticky situation with the poorly drafted Proceeds of Crime Act is expected to be changed relatively imminently in Gibraltar. So if this policy reform goes through, it would enable legal investments to be made from Gibraltar into recreational cannabis businesses. So GFIA has been lobbying to ensure that investments can be made in cannabis businesses where it's legal, where the activity is being undertaken. And this is likely to provoke significant interest in operating in Gibraltar and position the jurisdiction as a place of choice. So there have been reforms around the world with people trying to lure in cannabis businesses. Malta has made a number of reforms which they made in order to lure in cannabis businesses. And we've seen Jersey, Guernsey, and the Isle of Man also reforming their laws. However, those jurisdictions, the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man, haven't actually fixed this Proceeds of Crime Act issue yet, which is a major blocker to investment in some of the most profitable businesses in North America. So it does potentially, if it goes through, make Gibraltar an interesting place for cannabis-specific funds, for holding companies which intend to operate a number of different cannabis businesses in different markets, and for the consolidation of cannabis businesses, and for an avenue for moving European money into interesting cannabis opportunities around the world as they open up. This is coming alongside a kind of a general wave of reform in the financial area in order to allow more investment activity into this sector. So the UK Financial Conduct Authority has authorised medical cannabis companies to float on the London Stock Exchange. And this was very difficult area to understand for quite a while. The policies were quite ambiguous, but now they have provided clarity, which means that we will see more cannabis businesses being floated on the London Stock Exchange, and we will therefore see more money flowing into the industry. However, the rules have prohibited businesses which operate in recreational cannabis markets from operating, which is driven largely by this proceeds of crime issue in the UK. So as you'll see, larger jurisdictions like the UK are going to be slower to reform their laws in this area and provide a more business-friendly environment for investments into legal cannabis businesses. And that presents opportunities for smaller jurisdictions like Gibraltar, who are able to make quicker changes to laws which aren't serving their purpose. So the interesting bit, if this proceeds of crime reform takes place, is this recreational adult use area of the market. So I'll spend a little bit of time explaining how this area of the market differs from the others, you know, and what's the size and shape of this market. So here we have a map. You can see the most notable part of this map is that most of it is still grey, as in recreational use of cannabis is illegal in the vast majority of countries around the world. However, this hasn't stopped a huge market developing in Canada and 13 US states, plus a lot of reforms elsewhere allowing decriminalization or other kind of reforms which fall short of full legalization. You'll hear a lot of people conflating decriminalization and legalization. Decriminalization should mean that a state has removed the penalties associated with possession and potentially small-scale supply without legalizing the actual supply chain of the industry. And legalization means legalization and regulation of that whole process from cultivation to commercial supply. So decriminalization, when it occurs, although a very positive reform for people who use cannabis and face the risk of prosecution, doesn't present huge business opportunities in general. However, legalization is becoming increasingly popular. You'll see that there's already some decriminalization in Mexico, but there is now legislation being discussed, which the court has ordered the government to introduce, which will allow the full legalization of cannabis in Mexico. Interestingly, New York has announced that it will be legalizing, that Governor Cuomo has insisted that he will be legalizing cannabis for recreational use in 2021. So that is quite an exciting development. New York switching over, even Texas now discussing a full recreational cannabis market, along with Montana having already legalized, so that will happen next year, and other states along with it, including New Jersey.
And George,
so
we've
yeah.
just got someone just raised their hand. I think it's Mark. Mark, would you like to ask a question?
Has Mark got the permission to speak on Zoom, Tim?
Here we go. We've just got a question come through, actually. I think it's probably relevant to what you just said. So he's saying, with the coming changes in regulations, do you see more banks offering services for businesses within the industry?
Getting banking services is one of the hardest parts of this industry. So businesses in North America are often cash only for this reason, which necessitates a considerable additional expenditure on security and a lot of inefficiency. Even fully legal businesses in the UK have really struggled, particularly because of this Proceeds of Crime Act. So I know that it took over a year for some NASDAQ and New York Stock Exchange listed fully legal businesses to open their bank accounts in the UK, and very few of the major banks will offer those services. So yes, as the pace of change in legalization speeds up around the world, we expect banking services to widen. There's a very important piece of proposed legislation in the US, which is likely to pass under Biden, which is the Safe Banking Act. And if that was passed, that would not legalize cannabis at the federal level, but it would facilitate the legal banking of all state cannabis businesses. And that would dramatically change the size and shape of this industry and the way in which it operates. So in Canada, where it's fully legal, Canadian operators can find banking services very easily with Canadian banks. However, US banks and UK-based banks struggle to provide those services because of their own compliance issues and the legislation in their own domiciled jurisdictions. So yes, I expect much more banking change. I expect at some point the UK to change this Proceeds of Crime issue, but I expect them to spend years before that happens. I think banking reform in the US will be much more rapid, and then those US banks will obviously provide banking services around the world as markets open up. And the Canadian banks are already in a good position to offer services to the industry. Does that answer my question, do you think, Tim?
I think that sounds good to me.
Okay, great. Okay, so that's the kind of look at how recreational cannabis, the seeds of it around the world. Uruguay and Canada being the only two places that are fully legal at the moment, but that will be different by the end of next year. So closer to home, here's what the kind of legalization of recreational cannabis, and obviously this is crystal ball gazing. So this is, you know, if you push me to answer this, this is where I think places are leaning. Obviously, reform is quite unpredictable, but Luxembourg have announced that they're legalizing cannabis for recreational purposes, and they are very slowly building the system that they will need to do that. Switzerland has a pilot that has been launched, which will be slow, but Switzerland has the most cannabis-friendly reforms already in some areas, despite not having a properly functioning medical market. But Luxembourg and Switzerland look set for reform to allow recreational cannabis sooner rather than later. Malta has, there have been lots of talks of Malta going fully recreationally legal. Not sure how soon it will happen or whether it'll happen, but lots of people are confident it will happen in the next couple of years. The Netherlands is now offering a controlled cannabis supply chain experiment, which is they've offered 10 licenses to cultivate cannabis legally to supply coffee shops. And we were lucky enough to have successfully won one of those licenses on behalf of our clients. So very excited about getting involved with the first legal cannabis cultivation for recreational purposes in Europe. The only issue with the Netherlands system is that this trial will last for 5 years, so it looks likely that we'll have to wait 5 years before they fully legalize cannabis, if they do, but it looks likely, just slow. Some people talking about Portugal legalizing within the next couple of years. I think it's likely very likely they'll legalize within the next 5 years, but quite unlikely within the next 2. Austria, again, some significant discussion around this, but it doesn't look like a pressing concern. And then Germany has the largest medical market in Europe, but surprisingly low support for wider reform. So although that's the largest European legal cannabis market, we're not expecting imminent change in this area. Now, I've conspicuously left a few places off this. This is just a kind of pick of some of what's going on. I think the prospects for the reform in the UK are very good, and I think it's not impossible that we could see recreational legalization in this term of government, although it's probably not likely. I think it's very likely we'll see it on manifestos for the next government, and that voters will be voting on it soon. Spain also has good prospects of legalization soon. So that's a bit of a take on where Europe is going. The bottom line is that it's slower than North America, where we're seeing markets open up every year, and South America, where we'll continue to see markets opening up every year. But the ball is now rolling, and this is a real live issue and we will see a number of European countries reform over the next 5 years. And then once reforms go through, these are the kind of products that can be sold. So obviously most people are familiar with pre-rolled joints and dried cannabis flower and hash and those kind of things. But where the real kind of value add and a high margin products are more in the vapes and the extracts. So these vape pens and vaping devices are very popular now, as are edibles. and topicals and tinctures and extracts. There is this huge range of value-add products that people enjoy in legal recreational cannabis markets. And yeah, it's not just flower like it used to be. However, that is still nearly half of the market in recreational legal markets. So I think this data on this side comes from Colorado in 2019. Colorado is the world's most advanced recreational market, having legalized in 2012. So if you're looking for trends about how markets develop, that's normally a good place to look. The scale of the recreational opportunity in Europe has been estimated at 13 billion. To be honest, I think that is wildly underestimating the size of the market, because this is coming from self-reported data. And so even though they do make a slight adjustment for the awareness that people don't often honestly report their own use, I don't think they have made a significant enough. I think the market opportunity in Europe is probably significantly over double 13 billion. But where we have better data, we have good data that the Spanish market, so there is this unique legal grey area in Spain allowing social clubs and the sharing of cannabis and the cultivating of cannabis for personal use. And that grey market is now estimated to be worth 4 billion euros in Spain. The UK illicit market has been estimated at 3 billion euros. Again, I think that's an underestimate. And the Dutch coffee shops, interestingly, only valued at about 1 billion euros, so paling in comparison to Spain and the UK. But there is significant opportunity for this market to grow in something very sizable over the next 5-10 years in Europe. Medical cannabis will still grow as well, and obviously it is the larger opportunity now in a lot of markets. Seen this real ratcheting up of reform over the last 3 years. Most European companies now permit some form of medical cannabis use, but the problem is a lot of those countries just have a system where it's very exceptional. So it's, you know, if you're a child with very significant pediatric epilepsy, rather than you're allowed to access medical cannabis for pain or sleep or anxiety, or one of the conditions that lots of people like to use cannabis for. But patient numbers and the types of products that are available are continuing to expand. There are no EU-wide rules or regulations for medical cannabis, so they're very independent from each other, and a lack of harmonization, these markets. And we think harmonization of European medical cannabis is still a few years away, at least. It's important, if you're looking at investment opportunities in this sector, to be aware that, you know, if a market says it's a medical cannabis market, they are very different in different areas. So a medical cannabis market in, say, Oklahoma in the US, roughly 10% of the adults in Oklahoma have a medical cannabis card allowing them to purchase medical cannabis. So 1 in 10 people participating in the market. So that's very significant. Then you look at a place like the UK with a very restrictive market where we've got under 1,000 patients. So the shape of the regulations will very much determine the size and scale of the opportunity. And in general, the laws in the US and Canada have facilitated much larger markets with much wider access, whereas the EU and places like Australia and New Zealand have built these very restrictive medical markets that work through traditional healthcare channels. So you still need a doctor's prescription, you still fulfill your prescription at a pharmacy, and it's all run in that way. Then you have other countries like Malta, Colombia, Lesotho, who've built models for export, and non-commercial models like the one that we've seen in Spain, which don't present many legal investment opportunities, but present quite wide access for patients. Medical product types, you'll see that they look a bit more medical, obviously less brownies, things like that, but in essence they're the same thing. They're the flour, they're vaping the oils, and then they're the formulations for eating, which are the same formulations used in edibles in the recreational market. Things like soluble strips, sprays, transdermal patches, lots of people talking about them, very few of them actually being sold. The majority of the products sold are flowers and oils for vaporizing, and other oils and pills for consuming orally. Have a quick look at this, which is probably is the largest opportunity in the UK at the moment, is the CBD and wellness market. This has had much wider reform around the world, and as you'll see, CBD products being allowed to be sold in China and India, with some significant caveats on that. But you know, we've got nearly all of the EU, nearly all of North America, China and India, so some of the world's largest economies all allowing the sale of CBD for non-medical purposes, for the inclusion in foods and other products. Regulations vary widely between these different countries again, so very difficult for countries to expand into multiple different jurisdictions, as the models require very different things. But in Europe, we're seeing the market predominantly grow in the UK, which has forged a separate path. The US is the world's largest market, but the FDA still maintains a ban on CBD in food. So there is a real struggle here for CBD acceptance, with pushback from the FDA and others. And I won't talk about these other markets because they're all very different, but the bottom line is that CBD is becoming increasingly popular and increasingly legal around the world. CBD is still sold in a real different array of different formats. As you can see, there's a real split between the different SKUs, the different products and their use. So most people using oils, lots of people vaping, lots of people using CBD in creams and cosmetics, lots of people still using CBD in the old-fashioned way, many people taking it as a supplement, and others consuming it in their food and drink. Here's the market sizing for European CBD. As you can see, 360 million in US dollars in CBD sales in the UK in 2019. And that's one estimate. And then, you know, there's another estimate saying it's 133 million. So there are quite wide estimates, as there's quite difficult to get accurate data on this. But I think these estimates are quite good, that the European legal market for CBD is at about $500 million and the US is at about 2 billion. Once we see proper regulation at EU level and US level, we can expect those markets to be quite considerably larger. And here you can see a bit about how, I'll go back, about how edibles and topicals are expected to drive the growth based on US. And we're seeing quite a considerable growth expected by 2026. And the last bit to speak about in terms of these markets is industrial hemp, which is becoming an increasingly popular thing to talk about. So the cannabis plant obviously isn't just its flowers, it's also its seeds, its shear fibers. So if you strip the rest of the plant, there is a lot of different compounds which can be used for food products, for industrial materials, construction, etc. So you've got textiles. Interestingly, Henry VIII used to have an order that everyone in England had to cultivate at least 1/4 of an acre of hemp in order to ensure that he had enough textiles to make the sails for the fleet. So cannabis has been used by the British Army and by the US for hundreds, thousands of years, but it's having a bit of a renaissance now as an eco-material, being used in clothes, building materials, bioplastics, fuels, paper, food, and hygiene products. And it is very popular at the moment for all of these. And the main limiting factor is there aren't enough processing facilities, there aren't enough people with the know-how on how to formulate and manufacture these products at scale. But the consumer demand is there for these products, and we're seeing the market grow substantially. So before I turn over to answer any of your questions, I just wanted to run through in a few minutes the major market developments lately. CBD market has undergone significant changes in 2020. First, the European Commission came out and said, this is a drug and you can't use it in food. And then the European Court of Justice came out and said, no, you're wrong. This is not a drug, and this can be, therefore, this can be used in foods. So that's kind of very top level summary of the situation. But basically, the market is now being allowed to grow as long as companies go through this novel food process and prove the safety of their products. We can expect to see products being sold legally around Europe. And the UK has set up its own independent novel foods process. Now, with Brexit, obviously, there is a divergence between the EU and the UK on what will be allowed in terms of cannabis extracts in foods and supplements and elsewhere. But both the EU and the UK have now set out that these products are legal and just need to go through the approvals. So we're expecting considerable growth in CBD markets, both in the UK and in Europe, as it becomes more widely legal. Large FMCG businesses are also likely to move in. Medical-wise, we saw a huge vote in the UN only a couple of weeks ago, which was a historic vote recognizing the therapeutic and medical potential of cannabis at the highest level at the UN. So that's something that people have been pushing for a very long time. It's something that should have happened a long time ago, considering there are a lot of cannabis derived products which are already proven in their medical applications. So that it's been clear that the cannabis can be used as a medicine for a long time. However, now that's recognized at the UN. That provides the support for more countries to reform their laws. And on that subject, France is opening up its medical pilot to 3,000 patients. The German domestic cannabis cultivation, which was established recently, will now be selling products to patients in 2021. And Ireland's launched a new medical cannabis scheme, which will be opening up next year. So lots going on the medical front too. On the market front, there was a huge boom in the share prices, and it was a good old-fashioned boom with a lot of poorly informed investors speculating on very overvalued businesses. And we have now seen the market come back to earth. We're seeing a new wave of really interesting companies coming through, and the valuations in the industry are far more rational now. So we hope we've seen the end of the boom and bust and the beginning of stable growth for this industry. So there was a huge crash in 2019, which has led to the more realistic valuations. Now, companies largely were overvalued because there was an expectation that reform was going to occur around the world much quicker than was actually feasible. Actually, building and implementing these systems around the world takes considerable time. We're still expecting huge change within 10 years, but less of this expectation that markets will open in 1-2 years. But there is increasingly positive appetite from investors over the last couple of months, particularly in the US, which is looking set for considerable growth over the next few years. And that concludes my presentation. I hope you found it useful. I'll answer your questions now. If any of your questions don't get answered, you can email my colleague Georgia. And if you want to email me directly, I'm just George at Hanway Associates, but you'll probably get a quicker response from my colleague Georgia. And so, yeah, please feel free to get in touch, but I'll answer as many of your questions now as
George,
I can.
thank you very much for that. Very clear, covered a lot of ground in a short space of time, so thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, so we've got actually Stephen Aguilera, he's put up his hand. So Stephen, I'm going to allow you to talk. Over to you, Stephen, if you can unmute your microphone to ask the question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, that's perfect. We can hear you, Stephen.
Hi, good afternoon. Oh, sorry, good morning. My question is, I've been reading research that even though the CBD market is growing, there's also a tendency that there's, in terms of medical use, THC is being researched a lot with regards to medical use, and that is also a growing part, which is actually taking it's taking even more. How can I say it? Investigations into THC are growing even further than that of CBD, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does make some sense. I think there's a misconception amongst a lot of people that THC is the thing that gets you high, and it's also the thing that can lead to medical complications like psychosis and mental health problems. And CBD doesn't get you high, and CBD is the thing that does all the medical applications. Now, CBD is the main compound with the benefits in terms of treating epilepsy, which is what has mostly been in the press around cannabis reform. Actually, if you look at the volume of potential applications, THC is probably the more useful medical compound. It has a range of different effects, including reducing pain, reducing spasticity, and lots of other potential applications that need more research. But yes, THC, in my view, has potentially more applications for enjoyment and more applications in terms of medical. But it's also important to understand that the two compounds work together. So if you take someone like Billy Caldwell, he takes like a 20-to-1 CBD to THC, and that helps his epilepsy. And then other people, the ratios of the two compounds together create very different effects in the body.
I understand, and I totally agree with you. But what I'm trying to stress is that THC as a compound is being researched in a wide scale, and now it's been looked into, like you just said, that the medical benefits of THC are far greater than that of CBD. So I think is the THC area, because it's psychoactive, it is a gray area, and it's, you know, it just brings a lot of legality issues into it.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And I think what's interesting there as well, Stephen, is this is why we now use the term adult use instead of recreational, because a lot of the sales in that segment are actually for a medical purpose, but not through a doctor. So a lot of people are buying THC for pain relief, for sleep, for anxiety relief, for whatever it may be. but they're buying it through a non-medical channel. So that's why we tend to call recreational adult use, because a lot of the sales are for medical purposes, just not through medical channels.
Right. Thank you very much for answering my question. Thank you. I hope it's,
thank you very much, Stephen.
Thank you. Have a lovely afternoon. Thank you.
Thank
You
for
too.
your question. All right, okay, we have further question that came through before the seminar started. So from David, George, do you envisage a wide adoption of blockchain-based systems for supply chain and product provenance?
Yes, there already are quite a lot of blockchain solutions for this industry. Most markets regulate to ensure that there is seed to shelf tracking of these products, so that every product sold can be identified to a specific batch and a specific plant. And a lot of the ways that that can be done effectively is through blockchain technologies, although some of the largest software providers to the industry also just use traditional software without blockchain. But this is an area in which there are very interesting investment opportunities, because there are significant regulatory burdens on the operators of this business, but there are also significant opportunities for revenues. So they end up spending quite a lot on their software solutions. And some of those businesses are obviously going to be doing very well as these markets expand.
Okay, thank you, George. Another question has come through from Mark. Thank you. With regards to the upcoming cannabis industry in Gibraltar, do you see us more focused on services or production? Perhaps a difficult question for you to answer at this stage, George, but maybe based on your experience elsewhere.
Yeah, I think it does. It totally depends on kind of what the reforms are when we see them. But I think Gibraltar's better positioned to provide services potentially, because a lot of people focus on this industry and think, right, so all the money must just be in cultivating and selling this product. But we've seen a lot of growth, a lot of profits in the early stage Canadian industry, but we've also seen a lot of production facilities shuttered, and that's because investors skewed towards investing in production and cultivation. There was an overproduction issue, and that now has been scaled back. So I think a lot of the better long-term opportunities in this industry exist in the service area. That's why I focused my efforts with our team on building out in the ancillary area, where there's more opportunity for legal revenues, and there's significant growth still available in ancillary services to this industry.
I'll just pose the next question. Please feel free, everyone, just to add to the Q&A or to the chat. George, just from me, since your working time professionally in the cannabis industry, which I believe has been about 5 or 6 years, what has been the single biggest change that you've seen?
The single biggest change probably still was when Canada went legal for adult use. That was the main event which precipitated the cannabis boom, because the upcoming legality of cannabis in Canada meant a huge potential for revenues for businesses, as well as a change in law which allowed a lot more cannabis businesses to be listed on Canadian exchanges. And that then led to a lot more money from listed Canadian vehicles flowing into the American market, where there is significant problems around listing businesses and raising legal money for cannabis businesses. So that change by Justin Trudeau and his team created a huge policy debate in countries around the world, including the UK. It created a huge frenzy of appetite for investment. It raised, a huge amount of capital for the sector. And unfortunately, obviously, a lot of that capital was misdirected, and there was a significant correction in the market in 2019. But the situation now is that we have large established listed companies which operate in the cannabis sector, and that's something that obviously we didn't have when I started in the sector in 2015. So it's dramatically changed.
And I think one thing that until we wait for some more questions coming through, one of the things that struck me is how there's a distinct lack of regulation in the EU, and the EU itself is of course well known for loving its rules and regulation, and compared to the US, it's a complete distinct lack of regulation, and so therefore there's clearly a catch-up potential like you've been describing. Do you think it's a realistic potential to see actually Europe catch up, and if so, which areas should one focus one's attention on?
I think EU harmonization is a way off. Drugs are a contentious political issue, and one that the EU shies away from. Cannabis is not treated in the same way, with the same drive towards a free, open, harmonized market. So I think Europe has huge growth potential, but it will be driven on a country by country basis. We already have a very significant medical market in Germany, led by German legislation. I believe we'll go on to see a huge market in the UK, led by domestic UK legislation. I think the same will happen in countries around Europe, and it will be a very long time before Europe catches up and harmonizes these rules. But that doesn't mean that I think that there's a limited opportunity. The EU has recognized the Dutch coffee shop model for a long time and allowed it to continue. And that's what I expect. The EU will stay out of the way of these reforms, much in the same way as the federal US government has, and allow countries to experiment and reform with their own laws on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, thanks, George. That's clear. We've actually got 2 more questions coming in before we close. So from Benji, once POCA, Proceeds of Crime Act, is reformed in Gibraltar, which jurisdictions do you see us competing closely with on the investment holding and fund services side? And what, if any, edge can Gibraltar offer? I think you've covered that slightly in terms of our ability to get fast to market in terms of our changing regulations, but where would you see our
Yeah, I think that competition close to home will be from Guernsey, Jersey, and the Isle of Man. All 3 of those jurisdictions are trying to reform and grow, and not just be seen just as tax havens, but to be seen as places which facilitate the growth of emerging industries. I think Malta, the same can be said. They embrace online gambling, they embrace e-gaming, and a lot of other growing modern sectors with some regulatory issues around them, and they will embrace cannabis. So I think those are the main places, but then obviously most cannabis investment is still, despite all the restrictions, going to come from larger markets. So obviously the Canada, the US and the UK in the long run. But in terms of, I think Guernsey, Jersey and the Isle of Man are really ones to watch. They're all reforming their laws in this area, all differently, and we'll see how it all pans out.
And the edge for Gibraltar, you mentioned earlier, could be legislative change happening and being able to listen to the market.
Yeah, definitely, and I think there is some significant benefit for Gibraltar being so close to Spain, because a huge amount of the knowledge and know-how in this market is in Spain, despite the fact that the industry still remains a grey market. Obviously, there is a thriving open trade in cannabis in Spain. A lot of the best plant breeders, a lot of the best growers are in Spain, and some of those have legal licenses to export to other markets. But being there so close to Andalusia, where a lot of the licensed cultivators are, is a benefit to Gibraltar, as well as having addressed this POCA issue, because I think the Isle of Man, Jersey, Guernsey have seen the more substantial opportunity being in cultivation and supply. That's not necessarily the case, especially as we're now seeing places like Germany facilitate cultivation in their own country. So I think focus on financial services and proximity to Spain are the two key benefits.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions coming through. A speculative question from Ed. Do you think that public exchange listed products like recreational companies, packaging companies and the like will become more specific and expand, i.e. strain type trading? What is the realistic progression in regard to exchange traded products?
I'm not sure I fully understand. Could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, so it's a speculative question. Do you think that public exchange listed products like recreational companies, I think packaging companies, etc., will become more specific and expand? In other words, i.e. strain type trading, which I haven't heard of. What is the realistic progression in regards to exchange traded products? I think it's in terms of companies trading on exchanges, I believe. I think that's.
I am going to have to bow out with a lack of. I'm gonna say it's not my area of expertise, and I can't say, I'm afraid. So sorry, I can't answer that one.
No problem. Well, I'll forward you the question later. Maybe we or perhaps.
Yeah, I'm sure someone else in my team could answer it.
Yeah.
We all have different expertise.
No problem. No problem. We'll just clarify that question with Ed later. How has the COVID pandemic affected? So here we go. How has the COVID pandemic affected cannabis investment and production? And would you say that the cannabis market has been resilient during the COVID pandemic? Question from Helen. Thank you.
Oh yeah, more than resilient. It remains one of, if not in some estimates, the fastest growing industry in the US. It was granted special status in almost every state to be allowed to stay open through the pandemic. It was deemed essential. COVID, whilst obviously terrible for society, has been broadly good for cannabis. It's seen people's, obviously, tobacco has done quite well through COVID restrictions. So has cannabis. People have been consuming more than ever. Legal markets have seen higher sales. In the UK, the reforms to medicine, allowing telemedicine appointments to work much quicker with deliveries to door from pharmacies, have meant that UK patients can now have a consultation with a doctor on their phone and have cannabis delivered to their door next day. So in the UK, it's expedited access. In the US, it's led to record-breaking sales in almost every market. And then with Biden's win and the potential for reform associated with the Democrats being in power, we've seen a huge pickup in interest in investing in cannabis. So from being the hottest thing in 2017 to an overinflated boom in 2018, and then a huge correction in 2019. Towards the end of 2020 now, we're now seeing real growth again. So 2020, whilst being a horrible year in a lot of respects, has been a pretty good year for cannabis.
I think maybe that's quite related to the next question. You mentioned about doctor's appointments via video link. So I've got a question from Keegan. Taking Malta as an example, although legal, there are only a handful of doctors that are able to prescribe cannabis medication. Is this the biggest obstacle of the industry at the moment?
Potentially, yes. I think it well recognised this is a massive obstacle for the industry. In the UK, we have the same issue. So what you're saying is in the US, you only need a recommendation from a doctor. So that's just a doctor writes you a recommendation. He says, you know, you have a bad, whatever the condition may be, cannabis may be appropriate. And then you then just are allowed to buy as much cannabis whenever you want. And that's how markets work in the US, and that's why they're so popular. Whereas in Europe, you have to actually get a prescription for a specific product, and you need to get it every time you need it. So there's a massive bottleneck on doctors there. And the problem for doctors is they are, you know, beholden to prescribe licensed products wherever they can. So products that have gone through full clinical trials. So they can only use cannabis as a last resort. So someone, you know, who has significant chronic pain has to go through all the available opiates before they're then allowed to try cannabis. So that's a significant barrier. I think in the real long term, the way to fix this is through adult use, so allowing people to purchase cannabis as and when they need it without a doctor. But there's also a process in the intervening time of helping doctors understand that these products are available, and smoothing the process with prescriptions. We are seeing some clinics in the UK where doctors, through these reforms, are now able to prescribe to significantly more people than they were previously, because their job has been made quicker and more efficient. But it is a significant bottleneck and obstacle for the industry, yes.
Okay, thank you, George. I think I have one more question, if I may, from Javi. Hi, George. Will the Gibraltar change in law allow for the repatriation of funds from Gibraltar to the UK, or will UK POCA still be an issue for UK investors? So if we change the law here first, the UK does.
Very, very good question. Should have dealt with this in my presentation. Apologies that I didn't. Unknown as yet. So it's a significant issue. It's likely. We don't know exactly what the reforms look like in Gibraltar yet, so I can't comment on the specificity, but it's very likely that the UK's own Proceeds of Crime Act will trump Gibraltar. So when people patriotize their money, they potentially still liable to these money laundering considerations. So that is a significant issue that we need to see the details of the reforms from Gibraltar, and whether they'll do anything to help prevent that situation in the UK remains to be seen, I'm afraid.
Okay. Okay, well, thanks, George. I don't think we've got any more questions. So let me just double check.
Okay.
So thank you very much. Yeah, I can't see any more questions coming through. So I'd like to obviously thank you very much, George, for answering all those questions. Just to wrap up, I hope everyone will agree that that's attended today, that it's certainly an industry that we should take notice of more and more. And certainly we at GFIA certainly believe we're on the cusp of legislative change closer to home that is going to be something to watch in 2021. I'd like again to thank George, our speaker today, for covering such a broad subject very clearly and instructively. And certainly we highly appreciate it, George, that you've taken the time out of your busy schedule to enlighten us. And lastly, I'd like to thank all of those who have attended today, and of course throughout the year, those who've attended our seminars and supported our endeavours. So wish you and everyone and your families a very, very nice Christmas, and of course a very healthy New Year.